the last argument, I think, which I found a very strange one, so maybe to expand this a little bit.
Calvinism.
Calvinism? I didn't find that.
What was the last argument?
No, that was I'm now responding to his
okay.
his so I think it's more fair that afterwards we each give 5 minutes to respond and then we can go. Otherwise, I won't, because I'm second, I always get it.
But I'd like you to finish.
I'm finishing. That's last thing. So that's the last thing. So I found an odd argument, which I think I would like to hear more about, is why the fact that we don't see minds without bodies in the physical world, why that would be an argument against seeing minds where God could not be something like a mind. I mean, it seems like, just because I can't see it, the whole point of something like God, a God who sustains the world, would be that he would, by definition, be somehow transcendent, something larger than us. God would be at least a person. It's a kind of classic theological response. But surely that would be somehow very other from the kinds of minds we see among human beings. I don't really see why that is a strong argument against God.
Okay, so this is, well, maybe it's a good starting point for the debate. Because Dr. Phillips, you said there's almost no likelihood to start believing in God and to find evidence for him, because there cannot be a mind without a body, and well, that's something that Dr. Louis is arguing.
Yes, let me very briefly summarize my main 2 comments, or my main 2 arguments for the thesis that there can be no evidence for the existence of God. So one was the question of priors, which is the topic we are discussing now. But the other argument was much more important, and that's not answered by Art at all. That is that you cannot determine the likelihood of an event given God because we don't have access to God's intentions. You should have independent access to God's intentions if you want to determine the likelihood that a certain piece of evidence will occur if God exists. And because you don't have access to God's intentions, no possible evidence for the existence of God can exist. That was my main argument. Now, you didn't answer to that at all. The other argument, which we are talking about now, is that the prior probability of the God hypothesis is very low, given our background knowledge about minds in general. We now know that no minds exist without a brain, or without some kind of material substratum. Now, God is defined as a mind without a material substratum. So the prior probability that God exists is excessively low. Now, even if you would have evidence for his existence, which I claim you can't, then still it wouldn't help you very much. So these are the 2 arguments.
Is this also maybe some sort of escape for you?
It's not an escape, it's
now,
an argument.
That people say God is defined as a mind without a body.
Yes.
But you want to see the mind like an organic thing.
No, I think that we simply take minds as we know them. So we have background knowledge about minds. Now, we only know minds that depend on bodies, and neuroscience can explain in detail why this is the case. So when you stipulate a mind without a body, our background knowledge says that this is very unlikely. So how do you argue away this background knowledge? I think that's very important. I can say, well, background knowledge doesn't count at all, but that's irrational because we always judge background knowledge being important, as my example of Cupido showed. Most people don't believe in Cupido. Why not? Because they have a lot of background knowledge which makes the existence of Cupido very improbable. Now that holds for a Christian God as well. Now, of course, you might redefine the notion of God like Spinoza did. Spinoza said God is the universe. Well, of course, the universe exists, then God exists. I might say God is my bike. Well, then my bike is God, of course God exists. So it all depends how you define God, whether his existence has a high or a low prior probability.
Dr. Louis.
So, those are quite a lot of points in a row there. So I would say that it was interesting because I think they do correlate in some sense with my key point that I brought up, which is that the problem really is in how do you weigh the evidence. And one of the arguments I made is that if you assume there is no God, consciously or subconsciously, that heavily biases the way that you think about these kinds of questions. But if you assume that there is a God, it biases you in a different way. You'll weigh the evidence in a different way. And I think Professor Philipson clearly falls on one side of that dichotomy, which is why he somehow thinks that the prior probability for God is clearly very small. I don't see how we can make an inference like that. Moreover, if you look at something, a question like why is there something rather than nothing, truly important question because we're here. Sit down, look around, think to yourself, why is this all here? Why am I here? That's an important question. And then you really have three options, I think. One is the option that something like matter has always existed forever and ever. The other option is that it somehow came into being out of nothing. And the third option is that something like a transcendent being, a necessary being, who sits outside of these rules completely, was the one who created this. And I don't really see, I think somehow you're going to have to make a choice on one of those things. Somehow each one of those three things is different and odd and strange from our kind of common sense. So therefore the idea that in common sense we have found brains that are not connected to something physical, therefore unphysical minds can't exist, just seems to me like you're begging the question, you're assuming that all that we have is materiality, and therefore all we can have is materiality.
But the case for Professor Philips is that he says, well, but this is what I know. This is how a mind works. And if we claim that God is a mind without a body.
Yes, sir. Yeah, so what I'm basically arguing is this, is to say, if we start looking at these big questions like why is something about nothing, it tells us that that we need to take some care in just using some of our common sense. They think like all that there is is what I can see, therefore that's all that there is.
So we have to.
So let me say that again. So what I'm trying to argue, maybe I'll say it in a different way. So what I'm arguing is that certainly for questions like what is God like, on questions of that nature, we need to take some care in saying, well, God must be something like a material object. Because by definition, God has to be the explanation, and the thing that explains the material objects. Does that make sense? So I don't really see this, I don't see why arguing that we don't have scientific experience with disembodied minds would somehow make God less probable, because neither would a religious person think that there's a high probability of disembodied minds.
Yeah, but now
in the physical world.
You are a Christian scientist.
That's right.
Wouldn't it be your holy grail to find out if God really exists and to find ways to find the evidence? But you're saying now, well, there are parts of God that we just won't, and we can't understand.
No, I'm not making this
He says it's a losing case. Do you agree with him?
No, of course I don't agree with that. That's why I'm trying to argue the opposite.
Okay.
And so what I'm trying to argue is I don't think that his argument that, I find his argument that we don't, so let me try to explain this again. So the argument that says, when I use essentially a scientific method and I don't see something like disembodied brains, that makes the a priori likelihood of something like God, who, if there is a God, is by definition the one who sustains the world, is outside the world, transcends the world, unlikely. I find that an odd argument, because you're saying the fact that something which is not transcendent doesn't look like something that is transcendent means that something can be transcendent. That's an odd argument.
Shall I reformulate your argument in my Bayesian framework? So you claim that the prior probability of God, of the God hypothesis, should not be determined by our real background knowledge about minds, because that would somehow be circular, you claim. Now, then I should ask you...
No, that's not what I'm saying.
I'm
saying it's not by our background knowledge about the materiality of the substrate on which minds work.
No,
because
so
by definition we're looking at the substrate.
We know about all minds that we know of that they can't exist without a substrate. So that's our background knowledge.
Exactly. So
that's the question. I use that
substrate that I'm worried about. Yeah.
I use that background knowledge in saying that the existence of God as defined by theists, namely as a bodiless mind, is a priori, given this background knowledge, very improbable. And that makes that evidence you might adduce, if you can adduce evidence, will not make a big difference. Now, my most important argument was that you can't have any evidence because you can't determine the likelihood of evidence given the God hypothesis, because you don't have independently attested evidence about God's intentions. Now, you did still not address that basic objection against the notion of evidence. So that's still for discussion. Now, I want to make one further remark. You said that the question why there is something rather than nothing is a very important question. Now, I have a very good colleague in Oxford called Deel, who unfortunately died a few months ago at Trinity College, who wrote a little book on this question, why there is something rather than nothing. And he clearly shows that a complete question is humbug from a logical point of view. Now, we could go on about that, but I give you the reference to the literature. So, Deel, why there is something rather than nothing. But even if the question makes sense, he argues that it doesn't make sense. But if the question makes sense, then of course, if you postulate a God, you get the same question. Why there is something rather than nothing? Because God is something as well. So the question, why there is something rather than nothing, cannot be answered by saying God, because God is also something. So you don't advance a second by claiming that God exists in order to solve this question.
Professor Phillips, you're saying, well, this it's like circular reasoning. And it's quite a claim for just some journalists to say.
That's not
No,
no, he's holding to he basically, I think, holding to quite a strong version of skepticism. So he says we can be skeptical about whether we ever know anything about the intentions of God. He's skeptical that the question of why there's the question of looking around and why are we here, or actually not that question, but the question of why is something about living is a humbug question. I think that's quite a strong.
But you need a lot of argument for that, so I can't do
that
here.
So I think that's fine. I think probably I and probably most people would not share that view. It's an interesting view. It's an unusual view. Probably we should spend a different time discussing it. Come to Oxford and you can explain to us why
God is not a solution. God is not a solution to this question. God is something as well. So when you wonder why there is something rather than nothing, and you said, well, God explains that there is something rather than nothing, then you presuppose something in order to explain another something, so you haven't answered the question why there is something rather than nothing. That's
but I want just to clarify, the reason I actually got away from saying this argument somehow proves God. I simply said that when you look at this question, there's really three options available to you. Every single one of them, which is odd, strange. And so given that that's the case, I think that tells us that we should be particularly wary of physicalist arguments against God. So saying something like minds only linked to substrates is essentially a kind of argument that's saying, well, all we know of materiality is that all the minds we know are immaterial, therefore they can't be minds. A little bit like saying all the trains that we know are on tracks, therefore no track means there's no train. Right? That's not really, that's an argument that only makes sense if you really presuppose some kind of theories of God. That's the argument that we're trying to make.
I think we'll have one more remark. Can I ask some questions?
One final remark. You said that there were three options with regard to the universe. Either it's infinitely old, or it comes out of nothing, or it is created by God. And you argued that all these three options are slightly astonishing. Now, I claim that the option of an infinitely old universe is not astonishing at all. There is no problem with that. The only problem maybe is a Big Bang theory, but that's a physical theory. There is no logical problem with an infinitely old universe at all. So every state of the universe would be caused by an earlier state of the universe at infinitum. Of course, in the 17th century they thought that the notion of infinity was problematic because they had contradictions in it. But these contradictions have been solved in mathematics, as you know. So the notion of an infinitely old universe, perfectly okay as an option.